Welcome to the final installment of the Provost Distinguished Faculty Lecture Series this fall. And we're delighted to have our speaker today that we've got, and I will let somebody else introduce him in just a moment here. I just want to tell you, this lecture series that we do every fall gives us a chance to showcase some of the exciting things in which the faculty of the University of Montana are engaged, and some of the really stunning research and artistic activities and design and things that they're in. And so there are a variety of speakers that we have dealing with a variety of topics, as one would expect. And of course, tonight we're talking about things dealing with ecology and evolution and important topics in the biological arena that extend well beyond the simple biological arena. So I'm Perry Brown. I am the provost, and so in a way this is my lecture series, but I'm just very happy that I don't give the lectures, that we have other people to give those, and we have an opportunity to really learn about some of the stunning activities in which our faculty are engaged. And so with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Chris Comer, who's the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and Chris will introduce our distinguished lecturer this evening. Chris?
Thank you, Perry. Can you hear me okay? Well, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's speaker. Ray Calloway is a professor in organismal biology and ecology, which is in the Division of Biological Sciences. And I want to tell you two things about him to start off. First, he's an incredibly successful scientist. And there's a lot of ways to measure this. One would be that being a biological scientist myself, most of us in the field strive for something like, 3 to 5 substantial peer-reviewed publications a year. And I went back and I looked at Ray's file just recently, and over the last 10 years, he has exceeded that by a substantial margin in every year. So he's incredibly productive, and I know from meeting some of his colleagues, he's also world-renowned in his field. Secondly, and maybe equally important, he's a really good guy. I called him up before this just to check with him about what I might be comfortable saying about him personally before I started the lecture, and the context of his work, and what would you like me to mention? And he said, just tell him what a great program I work in and what fabulous colleagues I have. It's not too many faculty given a chance to shine like this that would say something like that. I think that tells you a lot about him. Ray's research tonight will talk about very big questions, and I'm not going to go into much detail, just say that one of them that he's going to touch on that I think is very near and dear to my heart is evolution. It's something that if you're a professional biologist, you hear it mentioned in the news media, you hear people talking about it all the time, and oftentimes those discussions don't capture some of the important nuances of that, and Ray's somebody who can translate some of that into understanding for a wider public, so I think you'll really enjoy that. The theory of evolution is something which all biologists take as a real, live, important, and foundational theory. It's not in dispute, and we talk about biologists arguing about it. They're arguing about nuance of mechanism, and Ray has certainly worked in this, and what he's going to tell you tonight is some really important and novel nuance of these mechanisms underlying evolution. So I'm really looking forward to this. Ray's really capable of giving a talk in straight speech, and for this I have to tell you, I went back again and looked at his file very carefully, and I looked at one of his older grant applications that had a very official and appropriate scientific title, but then under it, NSF asked you to translate that into everyday speech that people can understand, and what it said was, basically what I'm going to do is use, and I'll insert here, sophisticated scientific techniques to determine what makes a weed a weed. And I think that's a great example of kind of translating what's potentially a lot of Latin names and fancy technology into something that we can all relate to. So let me tell you real quick about Ray's background. He was born in Chicago. He spent some time in Alaska. He spent some formative years in California. He got his bachelor's degree at Westmont College. He did a master's at the University of Tennessee, and then a PhD at UC Santa Barbara. He then did the customary postdoctoral research, and he did that at UC Santa Barbara and at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He joined our faculty in 1993. He was promoted to associate professor in 1998. In 2003, he was promoted to a full professor. And one of the things that's, once again, a reason why he's here tonight is if you look at his record, he didn't slow down when he became full professor. It looks like he sped up, and he's really been incredibly productive. And finally, one quote about him that I think is really important because it speaks to his personality and his intellectual maturity. On his website, he says, quote, "Because of how many graduate students have influenced my interests over the past 15 years, most of my time is now spent exploring how exotic invaders can dominate some habitats." That's something we all strive for, is the ability to integrate the great thoughts of our own students in a way where we do something good with them, but we give them full credit and raise a master at that. So without further ado, let me introduce Ray Calloway, who's going to speak tonight on Darwin versus Kropotkin, just how red in tooth and claw is nature. Ray?
I'm mic'd a little differently than I think the other folks were, so if you can't hear me in the back, say something or turn me up or down up there in the window. Before I get started, I want to really thank you guys for coming. I mean, this is Wednesday night. There's no football or anything, but I still really appreciate the fact that you guys came out to listen to me for 30 to 40 minutes or so. So I was asked, I mean, I'm a community ecologist. I work at a little tiny scale. I clip things and count things and crawl around in alpine systems. But I was asked to give a talk, you know, to kind of stretch a little bit, kind of try to speak to a broader audience, not just to ecologists. So I'm going to try to do that. I'm not an artist. I'm not going to really talk about art. But I am going to try to talk about sort of broad perspectives on nature. And in this audience and through history, we've had many perspectives on nature. And they range from perspectives in which nature is a terrifying, horrible, scary place that we have to defeat or overcome to actually survive and move on in life, maybe as illustrated in this picture, to the opposite perspective in which nature is sort of a refuge, a place where we can go to get away from the scary things, maybe in civilization or from other people. And this kind of continuum of the way we think about nature really does, I think, affect the way we see ourselves, perhaps sort of our relationship to each other, our relationship to others in our culture and in our society, our responsibility to them, our interactions or relationships with people in other cultures, and maybe most importantly, our consumption, our choice of what we might choose to actually eat or drink or buy. Actually, that's not true at all. Probably the most important way that nature does affect the way that we think, or I should say our perspective on nature, is maybe in our world view, as is illustrated in this excerpt from a poem from Alfred Lord Tennyson. And here, Tennyson's pretty upset here. He's not a happy guy. He's upset with people who have a particular worldview, maybe a theocentric worldview. And he says, you people who think that God is love and that love is creation's final law are crazy. Nature is red in tooth and claw. And without any reserve, nature shrieks against your creed. Now, we may agree with this or we may not, but nevertheless, this is a great example of someone going to nature to create or develop or refine their worldview. It may be a little bit philosophically or theologically sort of immature to some of us, but nevertheless, it's strong. Now, all of this aside, I think all of us, many of us, probably all of us, would agree that our perspective on nature has been influenced more by this guy, Charles Darwin, than probably anybody in history. And it's because of his publication, The Origin of Species Through Natural Selection, that we have this perspective. That's maybe a little bit unfair, but we do attribute to Darwin a substantial amount of our perspective on nature being red in tooth and claw, competition, antagonistic interactions being the driver of natural selection, and the survivors of those negative antagonistic interactions being who get to pass on their genes to the next generation. And also, this is interaction, this is struggle within a species, within a population. Okay? Now, Darwin, that simplifies Darwin in a very unfair way, and I'll expand on that in just a little bit. Whoops, wrong way. But to a large degree, it was people that followed Darwin that began to take his ideas and move them out into sociology, into other parts of life. People like Herbert Spencer are a lot less known, but in his day, he was a very famous and well-known English philosopher. And he was one who actually coined the term survival of the fittest, and he was one who actually pushed hard to move Darwin's ideas into the social fabric of his life. And I wouldn't say he's directly responsible, but from his ideas, a lot of people began to sort of participate in what we might call social Darwinism. And social Darwinism, sort of this extrapolation of Darwin's biological ideas into society, as we know now, has ended up with a lot of incredibly negative consequences. It's been the foundation for the mistreatment of a lot of people and a lot of bad behavior by people over the last 100 years or more. And it's this this response to social Darwinism in which the next player is sort of in this story comes along, this guy who very few people have heard of, Peter Kropotkin. And he was a prince. He was a prince until he was 12. And when he was 12, he decided his dad treated the peasants just a little too bad. And so he said, I'm not a prince anymore. I quit. And he wrote this book, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution. And I want to emphasize this factor of evolution at the bottom because he argued that mutual aid was really dramatically overlooked as an important aspect of evolution, and where I'm going to go at the end of my talk into ecology. To be really clear, first, Kropotkin was kind of a crazy guy. He was an anarchist, he was a politician first, and a biologist second. And Darwin most certainly was not. Darwin was a biologist. He said, well, what I find out in biology, fine, you guys figure it out for the rest of life. Kropotkin really had an argument to make, and that was basically anarchism and socialism. But nevertheless, he relied on a lot of mutualistic sorts of examples. And it's these two people I want to use to contrast, or set up sort of a contrast for my talk. Now, to give you a quote from Kropotkin that illustrates where he's coming from, is this. It's underpopulation, not overpopulation, being the distinctive feature of that immense part of the globe, which we name Northern Asia or Siberia. I'll show you a picture in a little while, from which I conceived serious doubts as to the reality of that fearful competition for food and life within each species, which was an article of faith with most Darwinists. Now, it's important to realize he liked Darwin quite a bit. He says a lot of nice things about Darwin. I'll tell you in just a minute. It was really his argument with a lot of people that followed Darwin that emphasized competition and antagonistic interactions as much as they did. So here, he says, in Darwin's favor, unhappily these remarks, and what he means, the remarks by Darwin that really did emphasize the importance of cooperation and mutualism. Unhappily, these remarks, which might have become the basis of fruitful researches, were overshadowed by the masses of facts gathered for the purpose, and he kind of seems a little negative here, for the purpose of illustrating the consequences of competition for life. So Kropotkin really does set up a nice contrast to at least our perceived perspective of Darwin, competition, and antagonistic interactions. Now, what Kropotkin did for the first two chapters of his book was go to examples of mutual aid, examples of cooperation in the world, and then began to build sort of a social construct from this. This is kind of dangerous. This is what the social Darwinist did, but he did it nevertheless. And he seemed to like beetles. He focused quite a bit on burying beetles. These are beetles that find dead things and bury them. And one of Kropotkin's illustrations was, well, these guys walk around by themselves until they find something too big for just one of them to bury. So then a bunch of them get together and they cooperate and they bury the thing, lay their eggs, and this was an example of cooperation and mutualism. He also argued a lot from his observations on ants, and in this case, ants feeding one another, in which these ants are actually doing. And he gave a number of examples in very anthropomorphized fashion about ants doing this. In this case, these ants are not only cooperating and feeding each other, they're also participating in a mutualism in which they're farming or taking care of these aphids and benefiting from what the aphids produce. So there were many other examples, but what I want to do is instead read sort of a summary quote. I don't read a lot in my seminars, but this is too good to kind of put it into my own words. So here's Kropotkin summarizing things in his own way. Don't compete! Exclamation point. There's a lot. He uses a lot of exclamation marks in this book, which is interesting. Competition is always injurious to the species, and you have plenty of resources to avoid it. That is the tendency, in other words, avoiding competition. That is the tendency of nature. It's not always realized in full, but it's always present. That's the watchword which comes to us from the bush, the forest, the river, the ocean. Therefore, combine, practice mutual aid. That is the surest means for giving to each and all the greatest safety, the best guarantee of existence and progress. And that is what nature teaches us. So here's Kropotkin, again, perhaps unfairly set up in contrast to Darwin, but in terms of a pedagogical tool, it's wonderful. Mutual aid, survival of the fittest. And since Kropotkin, we have learned a tremendous amount about mutualisms, and I just want to give you a few examples. These are lichens, and all lichens are mutualisms. They are a combination of a fungus and an algae. They always work together, and they're so precise that we actually name these mutualisms like we do species. They get a genus, and they get a species. It's pretty amazing. Another mutualism, one more slide. These lichens can actually become dominant in very stressful conditions, and stress is going to be part, when we come into that later in my talk. They can be very dominant in stressful conditions like here in the Namib, or for example in Antarctica, where they can survive where no vascular plant can. Another example of a mutualism that's everywhere is this relationship between a fungus and between a root. The fungus and the root combination, this is called a mycorrhizae, myco for fungus, rhizae for root. The fungus extends the root system of the plant and acquires nutrients and actually protects against pathogens, while the plant feeds the fungus photosynthesis. And this mutualism is found in probably 80% of all of Earth's plant species. Coral reefs are built upon, they are mutualisms, built from a mutualism in which the animal polyp houses algae. Algae do some photosynthesis, provide some food to the animal provides a place for the algae to live. Even our fantastic Montana hay can't get fully processed without the practice of a mutualism. So cows can't digest the cellulose, which has most of the stored energy in hay, without mutualistic microbes in their stomach. And in the same way, one of the most prolific sort of mutualists on Earth, these mound-building termites, which they themselves are an example of cooperation, the division of labor within the mound. These mound-building termites can't process the wood in your house, and they can't process the grass in semi-arid Africa, again, without microbes that exist in their gut. These are an example of African termites doing different jobs. And here's an example of the termite at the top of the screen here. And this is an excised termite gut. And inside the gut, there are organisms that do all of the processing of the cellulose. Termites can't do a thing without that mutualistic relationship. Termites provide a house, a home for the microbe, and the microbe does the digesting of the cellulose. And this mutualism has really profound ecosystem and landscape scale consequences. This is a satellite view of the Okavango Delta, which is a fantastic inland delta, one of the finest places for seeing still remaining richness of African flora and fauna. And it's built sort of from a system of islands and waterways. And islands develop to a large degree, I hope this is visible on the screen, the islands develop to a large degree because of the activity of termites. These are all relatively new islands that initiate as a termite mound and then over years begin to coalesce and grow into most of the permanent terrestrial system that make up part of the Okavango Delta. So here's a mutualism with this fantastic sort of ecosystem consequence. So there are many examples of mutualisms on which Kropotkin never touched. But what I'd like to do now is kind of leave this and kind of think for just a minute about what we might know or think now about mutualisms and evolution. Now, I wrote this paper in 2009 with a colleague, Zalkik Vidzi, who was a guy I worked with in the Republic of Georgia. And in this paper, we didn't think of anything new at all. all we really did was try to organize the literature on what people thought about cooperative or mutualistic interactions in evolution. And so basically what we found was sort of a widespread belief was that natural selection worked just great, no theoretical or conceptual problems at all for competition until you got to major transitions. And again, these weren't our ideas, but what we found in many cases, or practically all cases, that evolutionary biologists turn to cooperation or mutualism to explain big jumps. Now, the evidence for these jumps, most of them, is pretty lousy. It's pretty darn weak. But in terms of trying to understand them, they turn to cooperation. And here's an example. I'm not going to go through these. But in all of these cases, these are the big jumps that evolutionary biologists have had trouble with, or trouble with explaining in terms of competition or antagonistic interactions. And over here are sort of the examples or the mechanisms or the drivers that evolutionary biologists have suggested for ways to get past these big evolutionary transitions, like pre-cell to cell, unicellular organisms to multicellular organisms, and so on. And in all these cases, what they do is bring up the idea of a mutualism or of cooperative interactions. So, pretty clear, we're still a long way, but it's pretty clear we've made pretty substantial advances in terms of getting mutualisms or cooperation into the evolutionary arena. But what I want to do is switch now and talk about ecology, which is what I do. I mean, now I'm talking more about something I know now. And if you look at ecology, community ecology in particular, which is again what I do, competition is fundamental. Competition is everywhere, and I believe it too. Competition is very important for what we understand about community ecology. G. Evelyn Hutchinson, Robert MacArthur, Jared Diamond, and David Tillman all have based some of the most important theoretical work that they've done on competition. And again, I can't overemphasize this. I'm not trying to throw competition out the window. I'm just trying to say that competition has been a very important aspect of ecology. But just as with Darwin and Kropotkin, we have seen in the last 30 years sort of a general clash of worldviews or perspectives on competition. And that's come from what we've learned in the last 20 to 30 years about something we call facilitation. And this is something that I've participated in. Facilitation is just a very general term for when one organism does something good for another organism. Instead of competing with it, it creates habitat, or it changes the environment, or it changes the interactions with yet a third species in a way that promotes the survival or the reproduction or the growth of another species. It's the anti-competition sort of thing. And what we've learned over the years is that this is really quite common. It actually started with this sort of system right here. In this case, what was found in the 60s is that the saguaro cactus, at least in this part of its range, is almost completely dependent on other species for recruiting from seedling to an adult. And so you see saguaro cactus underneath the canopies of other species. It prefers Palo Verde trees. I thought I saw Dick Hutto come in here. There he is back there. He actually measured that with students back, the 1940s or something, I'm not sure. Yeah. This has been shown many, many times for many different kinds of species. This is called the nurse plant effect. And now, over the last 30 years, we realize, I'm just going to give you some tasters here, that organisms can facilitate each other in many different ways. Many trees fertilize soil beneath them and increase the productivity of ecosystems through their litter or through the water that washes through their canopy, which contains more nutrients. And by doing that, changing the environment beneath them so productivity might go up by a factor of 2 or 3. On the other hand, some plants, including shrubs and like Great Basin sage, pump water to the surface. They don't do it for other plants, but they do it for themselves. But it ends up facilitating some species that can take advantage of that water, and in some cases may be in big trouble if they don't get it. Cattails can pump the other direction. Cattails pump oxygen from the air into the soil, and by aerating the soil can facilitate other species and allow them to coexist in the same place. All of these are examples of facilitation. Another type of facilitation, which is very common, are these indirect interactions in which species that are well defended, either physically like this species, or biochemically provide a refuge or provide some sort of protection for other species that aren't well defended. And this sort of interaction, again, has been shown many, many times. Now, perhaps more importantly than this, more recently we've begun to realize that these interactions don't operate in a vacuum or independently from one another. And this is illustrated really very well in this cartoon. This cartoon is showing that facilitative and competitive interactions are happening at the same time. And I'm really quite sure this is true for the kinds of mutualisms that I showed you before. Most mutualisms can vary between almost a parasitic interaction under some conditions and a strongly mutualistic interaction under other conditions. And in this case, what we see are two different species of plants. Here's the sunflower, here's the bindweed. And the flowers are smiling at each other. You know, you attract a pollinator for me, and I'll attract a pollinator for you. Let's work together on this. Their hands are, the leaf hands, whatever they are shaking, shaking hands. You know, you shade me from the shade a little bit, from the sun, and I'll do the same for you because it's very hot. And one plant is climbing up on top of the other, you know, benefiting from the stem. Well, below ground, if you can see it, all the little roots have nasty faces and they're fighting with each other. You know, give me that nitrogen. No, you give me that phosphorus. And what it illustrates very nicely is a balance of interactions with the potential to constantly shift depending upon the environment. And that's where we've gone in community ecology in terms of trying to understand positive and negative interactions. So in 1994, I published this little smiley face graph with Mark Burton-Ness. Actually, this is a great example of facilitation among humans. This is probably my most highly cited paper I've ever published, and this idea is not mine at all, zero, zip. It's all Mark Burton-Ness's. He invited me to participate on this paper. This hypothesis now is, ironically, probably associated with me more than with anybody else, but full disclosure, it was not my idea, it was Mark's. Nevertheless, what we hypothesized is that, hey, competition and facilitation ought to vary along gradients of stress, and it ought to vary along gradients of consumer pressure or herbivory. And to make it very simple, when stress gets high, facilitation, our mutualisms, our cooperation should increase. We should see it more often. When stress is low and productivity is high, we ought to see more competition. And the same thing with consumers. When consumer pressure is high, we ought to see a lot of facilitation. When consumer pressure is low, we shouldn't see very much. So, actually, parts of this gradient have been studied to death. On this side of the gradient, which really deals with abiotic stress, there have probably been 200 studies of stress gradient and shifts in competition and facilitation. And very often, that's exactly what people find. When things are tough, you see more facilitation. When things are nice, okay, now we're competing for things. And it's interesting, this kind of ties back into this whole Kropotkin-Darwin thing. Kropotkin himself says, well, you know, my perspectives on mutual aid were really affected by, you know, where I'm from, where I lived. And then I kind of traipsed around in Siberia where things are nasty, and I thought I saw everywhere I looked mutual aid, cooperating organisms. Darwin never actually, to my knowledge, really, he said a lot of stuff, so it's hard to know what he did or did not say. He may have derived a lot of his perspectives on nature because he worked in systems like this, kind of this riot of species interactions and species diversity in tropical and subtropical systems, or the benign environments of England where he lived most of his life. So, interesting contrast when we think about Darwin and Kropotkin in terms of abiotic stress and the importance of these interactions. So what I want to do now is shift into just a little bit, and it won't be much, and then I'm going to wrap things up really pretty clearly, of work that I've done with a group of international researchers. These guys are from all over the world, and we've worked all over the world on gradients related to abiotic stress and species interactions, competition and facilitation. And it's this kind of thing that I'm talking about. On gradients where down here at this end, abiotic stress is at least relatively low. Productivity is relatively high. And up at this end of the gradient, abiotic stress is crazy, very intense, very low productivity. And to give you an example, this may be something that you'd see at the low end of the gradient where abiotic stress is not so bad. maybe not like the tropics, but still not so bad, in which species productivity is high and diversity is relatively high. At the other end of the gradient, we may see something like this. Cushion plants with cushion morphologies, for example, at high elevations in the Andes. And what we did was basically in 11 different mountain ranges in different countries, both at high and low elevations, we did experiments with many different species. And we didn't do rocket science. Really, all we did was for many pairs of species, many pairs for many species, remove their neighbors and ask how they performed with their neighbors removed, versus having their neighbors still intact. And again, we kind of did this just by, in many places with many species, looking for general patterns, focusing at stressful places and not so stressful places. Now I'm only going to show you a few graphs. Again, I was told to make this for a general audience. Scientists can't hardly talk to each other without graphs, so forgive me for doing this. I'll get lost without something like this. This graph shows the main results for that study. Each graph shows the results for a particular place in a particular mountain range. So this panel right here is from somewhere in British Columbia or Alberta. This is the intensity of the interaction. If it goes down, it's competition. If it goes up, it's facilitation. If this black is low and this white is high. And you can just run your eyes around the graph and see the very general pattern. And it's very statistically robust. Low elevation plots, you see a lot of competition. In the Arctic, not much is going on. But you see a lot of competition, that black bar, as you go around, at the low elevation sites. And this shifts to facilitation when you move to a high elevation site. And this, again, was reasonably consistent in mountain ranges around the world. This is consistent with this abiotic stress gradient thing. When times get tough, facilitation or cooperation or mutualistic interactions matter. What we're doing now, actually we're finishing this up, is working with these very stress-tolerant cushion forms in a different way. It's not experimental. It's a giant descriptive project. I'll just give you more detail in a minute. But we're focusing on these cushion plants. This is Silene acalis, or moss campion in Glacier in the Northern Rockies. And as you can see, there are many species associated with this thing, and not very many out here in the open. And we're using this spatial pattern and experiments that actually kind of test the spatial pattern previously to ask what these very stress-tolerant tough guys do in terms of regulating biological diversity, plant diversity in mountain ranges throughout the world. So here's another example. This is a cactus cushion in the Andes. And again, you can see a lot of species inside and not much outside. So we've worked in about 80 sites around the world, and there's maybe 50 people involved in this. 15 different mountain systems, over 1,000 species, 40 cushion species from 13 different families. So we've really tried to cover a very broad range of taxonomic variation here when we try to ask this question about diversity and facilitation. And what this map shows is the results. Kind of a giant cluster of things, and I've tried to expand them over here. But blue means we found evidence for facilitation. Lots and lots of species inside the cushions. These foundation species are really doing something important for diversity. Red is a negative interaction correlating with what we think is competition. White is neutral. And the size of the circle means really strong facilitative effect. And as you can see, if you just look around the world, what we see is primarily blue. And probably the most important take-home message of this is that we found globally the importance of this foundation species, this biotic effect, was almost exactly as important as a correlate with biological diversity as any measurement we could come up with climate, which is a pretty amazing thing. Climate is supposed to control diversity at the scale of the Earth, not these sort of biotic interactions. And if we take it back, and this is my last graph, if we take it back to this idea of the stress gradient, well, the stress gradient is down here on this axis. Over here, productivity is high, total site cover, and stress is probably quite a bit lower. Over here, stress is high and productivity is quite a bit lower. And this is the strength of the interaction. Up here, facilitation, down here, competition. So what we see when there's very low cover, I mean really stressful conditions, lots more facilitation, and that tends to, well, it significantly does, go away as we move into alpine systems that are not so abiotically or physically stressful. So, what does that mean? Interestingly, when we come back to Kropotkin and to Darwin, I think one of the most important sort of summary points I would make is despite the fact that we see examples of mutualism and mutual aid along the lines of Kropotkin, and it's something that I study, we don't see any evidence that sort of banding up or working together makes the world any less red in tooth and claw. So for example, just because these African wild dogs are cooperatively hunting together, they're working together, it doesn't make the fate of that zebra any less sort of mild. Nature is still quite red in tooth and claw, despite the fact that we have an astounding amount of cooperation and mutualism happening on the planet. In the same way, this example that I gave you here of the saguaro facilitating, of the palo verde facilitating all of these saguaro plants, the cacti. These cacti grow up and kill the saguaro. It only takes about 30 or 40 years in which these well-nursed plants end up become a little bit redder in tooth and claw and outcompete and kill their nurse. And this is something that we see consistently in studies of facilitation and competition. So I'd like to leave you with this idea, and you can decide for yourself how this might affect your worldview in some way, Tennyson or not. But there's no question that both in the realm of evolution and in the realm of ecology, we see now this fascinating interplay between competition and cooperative interactions that really sum up the current fabric of life as we know it. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll do my best to answer questions. Just don't ask philosophical ones, because biological ones. I'm not calling on you, Marin. Yes, John, Dr. Marin.
You know how I can't resist this. So, what's interesting, I really enjoyed your talk. You go to an alpine place, you see cushion plants, you see plants growing in cushion plants, facilitation. You look next door and there's no plants. So at some level, you look at that scene, you say, okay, the cushion plant's habitat. Where you get habitat, you get other creatures that rely on that habitat for their existence. Okay, you go to the tropics. You got a lot of trees, that's habitat. You got a lot of other things there that rely on that habitat. You don't see the other case, that is bare rock, because all you have is habitat. You don't have the no habitat comparison.
Oh yeah.
But perhaps facilitation is happening at the level of plants providing habitat for other organisms in the same.
You could make that argument for the tropics very, very strongly, because, for example, 10% of the biological diversity of most tropical forests. And this is why how you lay out the particular scale of the gradient you work at is so important. Otherwise, you're lost in the mess. It's much easier to work along an elevational gradient than tropics to Arctic. But nevertheless, in the tropics, facilitation is common. In other words, 10% of the flora of many tropical forests are epiphytes, and they all rely on habitat created by tropical trees. So, somehow you'd have to go in there and add it up to figure it out. But there's no question. I'm not trying to say that nature is nothing but red and claw in the tropics. It just might be a little redder, a little pinker once you get up to the Arctic. No, that's a good point. Chris.
Since you've worked on invasive species, could you say something about how invasive species might interact with the balance between mutualism and competition?
So Chris asked me, that, since you work with invasive species, and I do mostly, how does that fit into this? And that's a toughie. I'll try it in a couple of different ways. One, it's really quite clear that invasive species do benefit from some forms of mutualism. Many invasive species need mycorrhizae, and they pick them up when they get here. Many invasive species are when they get there. Many invasive species also are facilitated by the canopies and the effects of other species. So that's been shown in a number of different studies. What I think is interesting, and this is, I'll even have Marin on my side on this one, what I think is fascinating about evolutionary trajectories and invasive species is that the ones we really like the least they have completely different ecologies in their native range and in their home range. Knapweed is a big sissy in Europe. Here it's a nasty thing. And we see this for hundreds and hundreds of species. And sometimes the only ways that I can even think of to explain sort of this biogeographical difference in invaders is evolution. They're coming here and they're interacting with naive species that have never had the chance to adapt to whatever they do, while at home, that's not the case. So I think from studies of biogeographical studies of invaders, we can begin to see some of these clues about the importance of evolution and interactions and interdependence in communities, sort of maybe a little bit of a parallel thing with this facilitation.
I wonder if you'd take us back to some of the details of that experiment where you took the neighbors away and compared the bare ground around a plant. What were you looking for in the plants?
So there were two. The first part was an experiment, and the part that John was fussing about was a spatial pattern kind of deal. So in the experiment, we removed neighbors and measured their growth, their reproduction, and their survival. And for all three of those factors, we saw significant changes depending upon elevation, or what we interpret as stress. So if you took away neighbors low down, survival was better. If you took away neighbors up high, survival was worse. Same pattern for growth and the same pattern for reproduction. Did I get your question? Was that what you meant?
That's it. It's real clear. Thanks.
Okay.
So is there sort of an evolutionary trajectory that leads from competition to mutualism in general? I'm just sort of thinking about we're all hosts to viruses, and eventually those viruses turn out to be asymptomatic, or we inherit gut bacteria, or eukaryotes take on chloroplasts, and so on.
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think that would be a question for practically all of biologists. I mean, I tend to think that, and I probably would get in even more trouble for writing a paper on something like this than I already have gotten in trouble for, but that one of the laws in ecology is that over time interactions wane in intensity. Given enough evolutionary time, interactions wane in intensity. Now, I can't prove that. You do have this sense from looking at systems that involve consumers or parasites or pathogens and so on. You do get that sense also from at least hints of it in terms of exotic invasions as well. So in terms of an evolutionary continuum, in other words, I'm not sure about that. I'm not even sure how I would get at that. There certainly are examples, or at least theory out there, for how mutualistic or symbiotic interactions change in intensity, over time between particular organisms. And it would generally, I think, be in that direction. But I'm not sure about some broader pattern in evolution. Dan.
Thanks. Super thought-provoking.
Thanks.
I enjoyed it. And I guess one thought that was provoked was, does this mean that mutualisms should be more likely to evolve in places where there's a lot of facilitation, such as stressful environments?
So what Dan asked was, does this mean it's more likely for mutualisms to evolve in places where you find a lot of facilitation? I think, I don't know if the two are connected in some way, but yeah, I think it's reasonable. That's quite a reasonable hypothesis to put out there, and is that you might be more, and we know a lot less about this pattern with mutualisms, just like John said. I mean, there are mutualisms everywhere on Earth, but in terms of their importance and intensity and frequency, I don't know of anybody that's tried to put that together. People are playing with it right now in terms of mycorrhizae, but I can't think of it. Well, maybe Lauren is. I can't think of another good example unless Lauren knows of one in which mutualisms have really been tackled in the same way as facilitation. Facilitation is easier to do because it's not quite so dependent. In other words, you can have it or not, depending on so.
So that oft-cited smiley face graph,
Yeah.
is there actually empirical support for both sides of that?
There's empirical support for both sides of that. Like anything in ecology, there are studies that say this is a bunch of hooey.
You're usually seeing a relationship on one.
Yeah, there is support. Oh, I see. Is there much support for the other side? Yeah. Okay, let me take it back. Is there support for the other side? Yeah. Yeah, not much. Yeah, not quite so much. It's a lot harder to work with herbivores in that way than it is to like clip plants or count plants and stuff. But there is. The best one that I know of was done in an Argentinian salt marsh along a gradient involving crab herbivory. I think the first author is the name Altieri, but I could look for it if you wanted to grab me afterwards. And if you're interested in it from a professional perspective, I can. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I can't see that well back there.
I'm going to stand up so you can hear me. I know that it's unfair to me, but I have to ask you the implications of both the vocabulary you use and the kind of scientific limitation of it for those moments when humanities intersect with science. So that if humanities look to science to say human beings are competitive or mutualistic or that kind of thing, they're going to be borrowing that kind of conceptualization. And it's interesting to me, too, that your entire talk was on plants and the image of competition of taking down the zebra was a very different life form. And so I do want you to address the philosophical.
I think it's very dangerous to use our perspectives. I'm just saying that we do. I'm neither advocating it nor totally disparaging it, but I would say it's really quite dangerous because there are some pretty strong arguments based upon flat-out pure biological Darwinism that make some sense for certain ways of thinking in a socially Darwinistic way, even though that results in some terrible stuff. There's been some pretty fascinating and disturbing debates. So I'm not trying to say that we should. I'm just saying that we do. I did use some examples early on in terms of facilitation, mutualism regarding animals. Once we get into facilitation, and a lot of that work has been done on plants. So I think we end up with a real hodgepodge of ideas and philosophies in here about ourselves and about the world, in part now because in 2011 we have a real hodgepodge of information about how organisms, if we make that connection anyway, a real hodgepodge of knowledge about mutualistic and antagonistic interactions. I think it's very, very hard now to draw some magnificent conclusion from nature. But again, I'm not saying I'm advocating drawing one's entire worldview from the behavior of caribou. So. All right, well, thank you guys very much. There's cookies up here, I think.